Hey guys, I'm Jacob. Let's learn about the brain and spinal cord. So, we want to take a look at the external surface of the brain. We see a lot of infolding, which increases the surface area of the brain, which is good because it has a massive amount of neurons. This infolding forms ridges called gyri and folds called sulci. The brain can be divided into right and left hemispheres. These hemispheres are almost completely separated. We will look at where they are connected a little bit later. For right now, it's important to note that their separation is due to the presence of the longitudinal fissure, a deep sulcus running down the mid-sagittal plane of the brain. We're going to expand a little bit, and you can start to see a little bit within the longitudinal fissure. The human brain, or at least the cerebrum, is largely divided into regions called lobes. We're going to begin by talking about the anterior-most lobe, the frontal lobe. The frontal lobe plays a major part in motor control of the body, as well as certain higher-level functions such as personality, decision-making, and emotion. The parietal lobe is posterior to the frontal lobe and is heavily involved in reception of sensory signals from the body. All right, now we want to look at how we're going to differentiate the frontal lobe from the parietal lobe. The frontal lobe and parietal lobes are divided by a sulcus known as the central sulcus. The central sulcus is bordered by a single gyrus anteriorly and a single gyrus posteriorly. The gyrus directly anterior to the central sulcus is known as the precentral gyrus. The primary motor cortex of the body is stored here. The primary motor cortex for the body of the brain. Now, directly posterior to the central sulcus is the postcentral gyrus. The postcentral gyrus is the body's primary somatosensory cortex. Somato meaning body, sensory meaning sensory, right? All right, now let's talk a little bit about the temporal lobe. This is the temporal lobe right here, and it's separated from the frontal and parietal lobes by the transverse fissure. This fissure also goes by many other names, so you may run into some of those during your studying. The temporal lobe is largely involved in speech reception, so much so, in fact, that Wernicke's area, one of the primary centers for auditory reception, is located in the posterior part of the temporal lobe. Let's talk about the occipital lobe, the most posterior lobe in the brain. The occipital lobe, as many of you may know, receives a lot of the visual input from the eye. It processes this input, sends parts of it actually back out to the temporal and parietal lobes. But we need to know that the occipital lobe is the major visual input processing center of the brain. As per the name of the occipital bone, you can probably guess that's located right around here. Let's talk about some structures on the inside of the brain. You'll see all I did here, I was never much good at puzzles, all I did here was pull our brain into its separate hemispheres. So, we're going to open up the brain, and we're looking at the inside of the right hemisphere. A couple important structures on the inside of the right hemisphere. The first one, the corpus callosum. It is this relatively even thickness band of tissue that's running in a little bit of an arch here. Can you see that all right? So the corpus callosum, we talked a little bit earlier about how certain parts of the cerebral hemispheres are connected. The corpus callosum is that major area of connection. It serves as a highway of sorts for the neural fibers to run from one hemisphere to the other. That's the corpus callosum. Right below or inferior to the corpus callosum, you'll see a small, almost triangular, but still kind of curved, almost like a teardrop of sorts, thin layer. And now on a real human brain, this is going to be very kind of thin, kind of opaque. This is called the septum pellucidum. The septum pellucidum is a septum, as indicated by the name, that divides the lateral ventricles and serves as part of the wall of the lateral ventricles. We'll talk about the ventricular system later on in this video, but for now, just know that it's highly important for regulating, storing, and moving cerebrospinal fluid. Now, above the corpus callosum, here's our corpus callosum again. Above the corpus callosum, we have the cingulate gyrus. The cingulate gyrus is heavily involved in the limbic system. Limbic system has to do with emotion, possibly some memory function, all that kind of stuff. All right, there's a lot of research that's being done into the limbic system and its function. Below the septum pellucidum, we have the thalamus, and the hypothalamus. These are both structures that are a part of what is known as the diencephalon. The diencephalon contains different structures, again, two of them being the thalamus and the hypothalamus. The thalamus is a major relay center for a lot of signals going through the brain and the body. It takes in a lot of sensory signals that stop here and continue on for cranial nerves as well as other nerves or axon fibers, if you will. So the thalamus, again, major relay center in the diencephalon. Now I switched to the left hemisphere so you can see this little structure here, almost like a little bean, called the pituitary gland. Before we talk about the pituitary gland, I want to talk about another diencephalic or diencephalon related structure known as the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus plays a variety of roles in the body, but one of its most important, and one we talk about in Bio 211, is that it communicates by sending hormones down to the pituitary gland. So the hypothalamus, one of its roles is in the endocrine system, sending hormones down to the pituitary gland. The other structure that I want you guys to know about is the pineal gland. The pineal gland is tucked back here, kind of on the posterior part, just below, just inferior to the posterior part of the corpus callosum, posterior to some of the other parts of the diencephalon that we've talked about already, like the thalamus. The pineal gland is really important for the secretion of melatonin, that is, the sleepy hormone. Now I want to talk to you guys about the cerebellum. The cerebellum is located posterior to the brainstem, posterior and inferior to most of the cerebrum. Again, the cerebrum is what we've talked about so far. Diencephalon, the other lobes of the brain, frontal lobe, parietal lobe, all that kind of stuff. So let's talk about the cerebellum. The cerebellum is heavily responsible for fine motor control. It has two major parts that are on your terms list, the first being the arbor vitae, or tree of life. That's all these little white lines here that you can see. That is white matter. The arbor vitae helps bring in a lot of the signals that get processed in the cerebellum and bring them back out. The ridges here we saw it kind of has these same foldings that we saw as gyri and sulci on the cerebrum. We call these folia because they somewhat resemble leaves. So all of these little ridges and foldings here, we're going to call those folia. We're looking at the posterior view of the brain here, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and remove our temporal lobes and part of the occipital lobes so that we can look at parts of the brainstem. The brainstem is the major network connecting most of the brain, including the cerebrum and the cerebellum, to the spinal cord and the peripheral nervous system. Now we want to kind of zoom in here and we want to look at the different parts of the brainstem. The first one we're going to look at is called the midbrain. There are certain structures that you need to know on the back of the midbrain that play a heavy role in the integration of auditory and visual signals. They are the superior colliculus, which is a little bump here, and also on the other side, and the inferior colliculus, also on the other side here. Again, the superior colliculus and the inferior colliculus. Now we need to talk about two other structures in the brainstem, the pons and the medulla oblongata. I flipped the brain upside down, but you can still orient yourself by knowing that this is the frontal lobe, anterior is facing you. I have the occipital lobe and the cerebellum, that is the posterior part of the brain, facing me. So with that in mind, we want to look at the pons. The pons is this large, kind of unassuming bump right here in the brainstem, okay? And the medulla oblongata is this more narrowed, tapered portion that looks more cylindrical coming out of the inferior surface of the pons. Again, we flipped the brain upside down, so even though it's pointing up in this video, the medulla oblongata is still going inferiorly. The pons and the medulla oblongata work together to help regulate certain bodily functions such as breathing and heart rate. Now on the medulla, there's a couple structures you need to know. First, you need to know the pyramids of the medulla. The pyramids of the medulla are here and here. You'll see that the medulla has a bit of a line running through it. Now that's because this model divides in two. However, in real life, the pyramids are actually separated by a small groove. The pyramids contain specific motor fibers, such as the corticospinal tracts, which go down through the spinal cord and help supply motor innervation to the body. At the pyramids, they cross over, which is part of the reason why, as you hear, the right side of the brain controls the left side of the left side of the brain controls the right side of the body. This is called the pyramidal decussation. That is the crossing over of fibers in the medullary pyramids. There's a structure that is deep to the temporal lobe that we can't see on this model, but you can see on many human specimens. That is the insular lobe. If I were to separate by sticking a spatula or probe in the transverse fissure, pulling down the transverse lobe, I may be able to visualize the insular lobe. The insular lobe is relatively poorly understood in function, at least as it compares to other lobes of the brain. However, it has been implicated in a variety of neuropsychiatric disorders, and it is believed that it has some connection to sensory integration. Now, we need to talk about gray matter and white matter. Gray matter is what we see largely on the external surface of the brain. It is composed of axons that are unmyelinated. White matter is largely seen on the inside of the brain, though this is opposite in the spinal cord, and is composed of myelinated axons. Myelin, as I'm sure you know, serves as insulation, electrical insulation for the axons, which helps drastically increase the speed of signal propagation. Now, I want to show you some white matter, and to do that, I'm going to remove the temporal lobe so that you can see this slightly paler section on the inside. This is white matter. With talking about white and gray matter, we also need to discuss the cerebral cortex. The cerebral cortex is the thin layer. Though we see a lot of gray matter out here, it is the thin layer of gray matter that surrounds the white matter on the inside. Much of the brain is actually comprised of white matter structures. All right, now we're back. We're going to take a look at the spinal cord. So, first thing I want to look at with the spinal cord, point out, is the meningeal layers surrounding it. We have some fat, some adipose tissue. This is in our epidural space. That's around the dura mater. The first layer here is the dura mater. That's the thickest layer. It's in very close proximity to the arachnoid mater. Here's the arachnoid, here's the dura. This space between the arachnoid and the spinal cord is called the subarachnoid space. It separates the arachnoid from the pia mater. The pia mater is the layer that is directly adhered to the spinal cord. This subarachnoid space is incredibly important for the flow of cerebrospinal fluid. All right, excuse me. Let's get a look at the inside of the spinal cord now. The first thing I want to point out is this little tiny opening in the center of the spinal cord. This is called the central canal. Cerebrospinal fluid also flows through the central canal. Now, On either side, you have what looks almost like butterfly wings. These are your gray columns, the gray matter columns in the spinal cord. You have a ventral column, a lateral column, and a dorsal column. The ventral column is primarily concerned with the transmission of somatic motor signals, that is, bodily motor, such as skeletal muscle, out to the body. The lateral horn is involved with transmission of the visceral motor, or the parts of the sympathetic nervous system. That's part of the autonomic nervous system. It's going to go out primarily to the to target organs in the body. A lot of them are right here in the thoracic, abdominal, pelvic cavities. That's where a lot of them are, not all of them. That is the lateral gray horn. Sympathetics, autonomics. The dorsal gray horn, way back here, that is for sensory information. So what happens is you have this root here. You can see all of these little rootlets. Sensory information, this is the dorsal root of the spinal cord. Sensory information comes up the dorsal root into the dorsal gray horn. From there, it can be processed and either go back out or through different levels of the spinal cord, even up to the brain. Okay? That's sensory information. That is an afferent pathway. So remember, sensory and afferent pathways, motor and efferent pathways. S-A-M-E. Same. All right? Now, we've got our our ventral gray horn. Again, that is motor, somatic motor, primarily out to the body. That's going to leave through the ventral root of a spinal nerve. So that's coming out right here. You can see that they meet up here in the dorsal root ganglion. The dorsal root ganglion, they actually don't meet there. That's not the most correct way to say it. But they get in very close proximity here in the dorsal root ganglion. You have cell bodies there for sensory neurons, bringing things back from the periphery up to the spinal cord. All right? And then they're going to go out as a mixed nerve. So some motor, some sensory fiber. Here is the ventral ramus of the spinal nerve and the dorsal ramus of the spinal nerve. This little guy right here has to do with the sympathetic nervous system, which we are not talking about in this video. However, just to point out the name of the structure, this is one of the sympathetic chain ganglion. Again, autonomic nervous system. Okay? Going back to the spinal cord, at least one more gray matter structure is the gray commissure. This allows for communication of both sides of the spinal cord. So in some cases, when you have information coming in, it actually is going to be coming in from one side of the body. A sensory stimulus on one side of the body can lead to a reaction on the other side of the body. So having communication between the gray matter and the white matter, you also have ventral and dorsal white commissures, helps both sides of the body communicate. All right? So again, this is the white, the ventral white commissure, and this is the dorsal white commissure. This is the gray commissure between the two. All right? You have the anterior median furrow and the posterior median sulcus. Those are grooves within the spinal cord. And see if we went through everything. That is everything that you can see on the model. Now that we talked about the spinal cord and the brain, we actually want to go back to the brain, revisit the meningeal coverings. So, just like in the spinal cord, we've got three meningeal layers. A dura mater, the outer thicker layer, an arachnoid mater, the middle layer, and the pia mater, the thin innermost layer. We saw this in the spinal cord with the layers. However, we also want to take a look at the fact that the dura mater is different in the brain compared to the spinal cord. In the brain, you have an outer periosteal layer that's attached to the bones of the skull, and then you have an inner meningeal layer. That's the layer that actually serves as the meningeal layer, primarily. The epidural space that we saw in the spinal cord filled up by fat is actually usually not present, hopefully, in the average human being. Because typically, if it is, that means that there's some sort of intracranial bleeding, right? So the epidural space and the subdural space are what we call potential spaces. They can be there. Usually they're the sign of something a little bit more concerning going on. The subarachnoid space, that is the space between the arachnoid and the pia mater, is present. And just like in the spinal cord, it is heavily involved in the flow of cerebrospinal fluid. The pia mater is more directly adhered to the brain, so we don't really see a subpial space. The dura mater has a handful of dural infoldings that we need to discuss, the first of which is the falx cerebri. We talked a little bit about the longitudinal fissure that separates almost completely the two cerebral hemispheres. In this fissure is the first dural infolding, the falx cerebri. It just runs right down this fissure. That's the first one. Next, we have the falx cerebelli, separating the two cerebellar hemispheres. And third, we have the tentorium cerebelli, like a tent or a covering. This is between the cerebrum and the cerebellum. When you're taking out a brain, it can become complicated if you're not being careful, because the tentorium cerebelli can act as a bit of a hinge of sorts on the connection between the cerebellum and the brain brainstem. And if you're pulling on a brain without carefully freeing it, you can actually rip the cerebellum and the brainstem right off the brain. What I want to talk to you about is the ventricular system. The ventricular system is important for the storage, production, and flow of cerebrospinal fluid. Cerebrospinal fluid can start off in the lateral ventricle. We already talked about the septum pellucidum, and so we should remember that that forms part of the walls of the lateral ventricle. It goes from the lateral ventricle to the third ventricle, passing through an opening called the interventricular foramen. From the third, it's going to go on to the fourth ventricle through an opening called the cerebral aqueduct. From the fourth ventricle, it can either go through the central canal in the spinal cord or into the subarachnoid space.